Welcome to Jack Colvin's Life and Encounters with Michael Chekhov. I'm your host, Mala Powers. Jack Colvin has been a professional actor since the age of 11, and at 12, he saw a film with Michael Chekhov called Cross My Heart. And he said to himself, who is he and how does he do it? By the age of 17, Jack was studying with Michael Chekhov in his home in Beverly Hills. And he worked with Michael Chekhov for the next 5 years until Chekhov's death. Although he's appeared in literally hundreds of television films and motion pictures, he's always returned to the theater. And I think he has a great distinction, and he may be the only actor that has ever won the 5 prestigious Los Angeles Drama-Logue Awards in 5 separate categories: as actor, as director, as producer, as playwright, and as production designer. He's taught the Chekhov method at the Academy, the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, and at the University of Southern California, and the Central Experimental Film School of Rome, Italy. Here in his home in Hollywood, overlooking Sunset Boulevard, he'll occasionally teach a class, not so much when the mood strikes him as when several students get together and demand that he teach them. He's also coached several stars in performances that have won them Oscars, Emmys, and Tony Awards. And here we are, Jack.
Hello, Mala. How are you?
I'm fine, and I'm delighted to be here with you today.
At last. After all these years.
Yes, and we did meet many years ago, long time ago.
In our
working with Michael Chekhov.
I think we were among the children of the Chekhov students, you and I, and a few others.
Yes, I think we were pretty young.
Pretty young, and at the very end of his life.
But how did you meet him?
Oh, it was as you said, I saw him on the screen, and then I began asking and was trying to will it to happen, trying to get to him, find out where he was. And I heard all kinds of things from people, but where was he? And then I heard that he taught, and how. Finally, when I was 17, my first year in college, a friend turned out to live 2 doors away from the actor Jack Larson, who was then playing Jimmy Olsen, the boy reporter on Superman, and he was studying with him. So by sort of bullying my friend to bully his friend, I made a connection, and then I was sort of interviewed by Larson carefully over the telephone, and he said, yes, all right, you could come to this class. And Chekhov was then holding a class in his home up on San Ysidro Drive in Beverly Hills, and it was sort of young Hollywood. And Debbie Reynolds was in the class, and John Drew Barrymore was there. I think before I came into the class, Debbie Reynolds had brought people like Robert Wagner. I later did a series with him, and I never asked him. Pierre Angeli and others. And I was suddenly included. I was about the only one who wasn't a young Hollywood rising something or other. And it really wasn't working very well.
Why not? Why not? What was happening?
Well, first of all, a lot of them were very busy. As you know, there's always the problem with teaching and connecting and everybody's work schedule. Some of them adored Michael Chekhov as a wonderful old saintly gentleman, but didn't really, as you know, understand what he was talking about, and were impatient. So for Debbie Reynolds, I think, tried to keep the group together. Mr. Chekhov, and I could never call him anything but Mr. Chekhov for some. He said, you know, call me Misha, and I know you call him Misha, but I just couldn't.
I called him Pixie mostly, and Mr. Chekhov in class.
In class,
but
yes.
He called me Young Pixie, and I called him Old Pixie, so
yes,
that's where we were at.
I was no young Pixie. I was a kind of a problem, but he was very patient with all these young people, but, and myself, But once he started on one of his pictures, he used that as an excuse to sort of dissolve that class. It was really not pleasing him that people could come in and out as much as they do. You know that with Michael Chekhov's technique, unlike a lot of acting teaching, you can't just set it up as a cottage industry, as a lot of coaches, I don't say all of them, do. You've been in classes, and we all have, where actors come and go during the course.
And that's very prevalent in Hollywood particularly.
Yeah,
right.
And the teacher, whoever it is, they do a monologue, a scene, they're critiqued, and they leave sometimes, come back. And with Mr. Chekhov, it was a certain amount of lecture and exercise following a particular series of particular exercises that had to lead to an overall technique. It was very difficult to package that or bottle that.
Right.
know.
Now, what happened later at the Drama Society? Because I think that was formed a bit later. It didn't work at
I was
Chekhov's
never
home.
sure when it was. I know you've talked to John Abbott, and I think John Daner and Lou
Right.
Krugman put that together. And Mr. Chekhov, when that group dissolved, took me more or less as a protege, which is to say, I asked him, can I go on studying privately? And then he told me what he charged, and I said, oh, and then he said, but you'll come anyway. And so I think, when someone teaches you for free, you're a protege. And anyway, I continued to work with him at his home every week, and then he said, we're going to be doing something at the Drama Society. So I had him then one day a week, one night at the Drama Society, and then another night at the Drama Society. John Daner usually conducted the physical exercise class, and sometimes Lou Krugman conducted improvisation.
Right.
So
I remember them both so well because we all worked radio together.
Yeah.
John Daner and Krugman were both big radio actors, and I got my break in radio. So
yes, you did. Yeah. So that's except for the period after he had, I guess, his next to the last heart attack. When he didn't teach, even then I saw him. It was very funny because I remember after he had the heart attack, Senya, his wife, said to me, she said, the doctor wants him, to walk, but he won't walk. But of course, in Beverly Hills, you can't go for walks because all the lawns meet the gutter, and there's no sidewalks. So I came one Wednesday afternoon in the spring, and said, why don't we go take a walk, Mr. Chekhov? She said, get him to walk. And he said, all right. And he met me at the door with a blazer and slacks and I think an ascot. And although it was a warm day in June or July, he had an umbrella, rolled like an Englishman, but a sturdy Germanic-looking umbrella. The doctor, he was afraid to take walks a little, and afraid he might fall. The doctor said, use a cane. Well, he didn't want to use a cane, although in photographs I've seen at your house, he had a cane.
Yes, he had lots of canes because I still have them.
Yes, that's where they are. Because they were dapper then, but now that he was older, it meant infirmity, and he didn't want to. So we had this umbrella, and we drove down, Benedict Canyon Road to that triangular park across from the Beverly Hills Hotel, and I thought, now we'll have a peripatetic sort of lesson today. And as we drove down, I said, Mr. Chekhov, do you think that it's going to rain today? It was about 80 degrees. And he said, no, it's a complete subterfuge. And I said, he said, when an old person walks with a cane, everybody looks down on you. Oh, I don't think so. He said, but when anybody walks with an umbrella, everybody looks up to see if they know something that you don't know. So he then walked a little, and we sat down in the shade and talked. And then as soon as the sun came to that area, he said, let's walk again. And we walked over to another shady bench and sat and talked. And it became Socratic and not peripatetic, and we went home. Not that crazy about taking long walks.
Right. So we didn't do very much walking. Yeah.
No, that was our one day of trying a walk. You were with him now, even before that, with the Akim Tamirov
Yes,
group.
that was, I think, before the group that he had in his house, because he was there really, and then I studied with him at Akim's house, and then of course after that the studio, I was with RKO Studio, and they gave me lessons with him, private lessons. But then I was also with the Drama Society.
Yes,
So,
that's where I met you
but
the
I
first
worked
time.
very little. I worked privately at his house, but very little in the evenings there. I
Yes.
was apparently working most of that time, or out of town on location or whatever, because I didn't work at his house very much in the evenings when the groups were there. Jack, you were already a professional actor when you met Michael Chekhov, so how did his work and what you learned with him really sort of impact your view on theater, or your own personal life, or both?
I'd have to say, sort of immediately and totally, it just rang a bell from the very beginning. Everything that he said seemed right. I never had, well, I had questions, and I was sometimes slow on one subject, how to separate rhythm and tempo and things like that, and definitions of things, but by and large, it was as though it's something I'd always been thinking was there. He also, I think one of the reasons he liked me, aside from the fact that I was receiving, just naturally born to receive what he was there to radiate, I guess. Also, he seemed to like the fact I was one of those kids with a sort of a large vocabulary, drifted and gone now, but and a lot of Southern California expressions and things, and he was intrigued by that. He would always talk about. He was trying, I think, to reinterpret his own technique into American speech and even kind of West Coast film industry speech. I wasn't in the film industry yet, but...
No, but he certainly, I believe that's true. He was always trying to find new and more effective means of communicating and of understanding the particular situation that actors were in.
And synonyms for the words that he had brought from Russian to German to French to English.
Right.
Now, to bring them up to date, he would say to me, how should it be? What should the word be? How would you say that, you know? And the word molding, he used to use molding, and I said, well, it doesn't really quite work. I said, because I was sculpting some, and I said, sculptors don't really use the word molding, they use the word modeling. And that's confused with people who stand in front of them and model for them. And molding is mostly when you cast a solid, inflexible mold for it. What should it be? So I said, well, why not just sculpting in space, just to sculpt within space itself. And so from then on, for the last year or two, he was using molding or sculpting, he would say, in the classes. And always he was trying to find some synonym, some new way of putting it. How it impacted my own life was, as far as an actor, was, again, pretty total. I began immediately talking to, I was working in an acting company called the Penthouse Theater in Altadena. I was the resident juvenile there for about 3 seasons. And I would drag young actors and actresses to his classes. They were all fascinated. None of them came back. None of them were also in the business anymore or ever went on in it at all. But I began explaining it to people, and some people would ask me to, well, tell them more about it. And so in order to prove that to myself that I knew what I was getting, I began teaching without even knowing it. And that changed my whole way of, I began to direct, I think, because I began to talk ideas and talk to actors.
I think Chekhov always wanted to do that, to get his actors to also teach it, because when he had a school all day long, like at Dartington or back on the East Coast at Richfield, Connecticut, when the Chekhov studio was really operating, he always tried to get his actors to teach what they had just learned. But he didn't have enough people around him that were the solid core to do that here. So it must have been a great joy for him to be able to have you do that, to begin to teach it and talk about it. And
yeah, he also hated to wear his hearing aid, as you know.
I do.
Was it the birds that you used to
Yes.
Yes,
it was the one day
birds,
that he had put his hearing aid back on, and he hadn't worn it in weeks and weeks. And he was giving me a lesson, and he was talking to me, and he was, and then he would talk, and we
Yes.
would do, and finally he took it and he said, those birds, they are driving me crazy. And that was the end of the hearing aid.
Even voices, when he would do the lectures at the Drama Society, he would take the hearing aid out like some kind of an amplifier and put it in one ear and hold the little battery speaker out. Your question, and then he'd take it off and answer the question. And sometimes when he would lecture out, he went out to UCLA and a few places and talked, he would ask me to come along, and I would, at the end of the lecture, when he went to questions, I would stand next to him and memorize the question very quickly, cut it down and say it to him, and then he would answer it, so he didn't have to use the hearing aid. Also, we figured out that the questions usually rambled, and they tended to be, I could almost say, question number 7 or 42B, and we never codified it, but nearly one could, because they would, oh, Mr. Chekhov, do you think while you're... It's thinking while you're acting. No, you don't. And,
it might have been a great deal different. Our technology's come so far. One would hope that if it had been a modern day hearing aid, he could have worn it and made his life a whole lot easier.
Yeah. Did you find that he aged considerably during the years that you knew him?
Yes. Yes, because Chekhov was only, 64 when he died.
And he was
he was an old 65.
Yeah.
He was extremely, I mean, it's hard for me to
20 years
recognize.
older.
He was, yes.
Yeah, at least.
He is physically, he was at least 75 or
85, perhaps.
or 80 by the time he died, and yet he was only 64.
The first night I met him at his home, I walked in the door after having, searched for this actor for so long, and he was then 59, and would sort of alternate Jekyll and Hyde, like between being very old and kind of caved in and being very youthful and energetic.
Yes, as soon as he began to demonstrate or to act or whatever it was, or to show you in class, a lot of that age just fell away. Of course, he could also become huge in front of your eyes when he was actually quite a small man.
He not only, we've all heard about his lecture on how to grow taller, and he became 7'3" or something before our eyes, and it was true, and it was miraculous. I once saw him act out a Gothic cathedral. He started to give a lecture on the subject of the upward pull of art, of thought, of everything. And he said from the smallest blade of grass to the mountains that there is always this rise, this moving upward to the higher something. He said whether it's heaven or it's Olympus or whatever it is, human beings have this. And he started to describe a Gothic cathedral. And he began with the Massa Confusa and the foundation and the heavy stones and the block and the cross and so forth and so on. And it took quite a while, and he would build up, and he would arrive at little circular introspective windows of stained glass, and then on upward to these spires pointing and reaching. And it took about 20 minutes, and as he did, he acted a Gothic cathedral. And everybody was absolutely dumbfounded. We just sat there as a group with our mouths open and our eyes out of focus somehow. And he said, "I'm sorry, I usually have a blackboard and a piece of chalk," but and he wasn't being coy about it. He really would rather have had the blackboard and the piece of chalk. His whole system was so trained with his concept of continuous acting, of living as an actor, as a painter or a composer or a dancer lives and experiences the world as that, that it was always responsive.
Mm-hmm.
He once talked about, you know how he loved clowns.
Yes.
Grock, the German clown, and he knew every clown in Europe and all their gimmicks and all their acts. And there was one, I think, in Budapest or somewhere that he had seen. And he was talking in class one night, and he said that this clown, you know, would stand in front of one, usually a woman, in the audience, and his whole act was to look at her and cry. And her embarrassment was the comedy. And having made that point, Michael Chekhov took off his glasses. On the word cry, enormous tear had rolled down his face. He wiped it away and thought nothing of it, but just the word, just the command to his system, and cry, it happened. And that's where he wanted us to get, I think. That's where he wanted the actor's system to be, so that you could do just about everything but bleed when you tell yourself to.
Right, and without having to have a reason for it.
Exactly. No, it was all physical.
Tap into that world of emotion that we're really all so close to. And when it happens to us personally, sometimes we don't even know why we either laugh or cry. And he wanted us to be able to do that as actors.
Yeah. Did you find when you and I were studying with him that people would say, well, Michael Chekhov is a genius, but geniuses can't teach, which of course negates everybody from Da Vinci to Einstein and a lot of people along the way. And the other statement was, yes, well, he's a great actor, but it's too mystical. And then the 1960s came along, and people couldn't get mystical enough.
Yes.
Everybody wanted to be, you know.
Right. No, when he did his book, To the Actor, which was in the 50s,
right.
Of course, they made him take a great deal more of the things that he believed in, of the what other people would call mysticism. He never called it mystical.
No.
And he said, actually, these intangibles that create the tangible are the truly practical elements.
Absolutely.
And I believe so too.
I do too.
But people didn't understand it so well in the 50s. Better in the 60s, certainly much better now.
Yeah, because from the mysticism or the search for something mystical in the 60s up through, oh, I don't know, aerobics and talk of endorphins and all kinds of energy centers and things that are becoming now scientific medical fact. It all ties to what he was teaching all along. The thing that bothers me about a lot of people, and they talk, some still do, of mysticism, the absolute practicality. You know, he always talked of the balance of the practical and the impractical, of the tangible and the intangible, of internal and external technique. But the truth is, when you get into his exercises, they are the facts of life. They are what we are doing anyway. He broke it down into, you know, pushing, pulling, lifting, throwing, dragging, tearing, expansion, contraction as archetypal gestures, or gesture is a kind of a hard word to translate. We just think it's something with our hands, maybe.
Yes, that's true.
I think all his life, Michael Chekhov had asked himself, he had begun as a young actor asking himself, what is it that we are to act? What is it to be a human? What is this mortal circumstance, this human condition in which we operate, and how do we do it? What is this organism that responds in certain ways? And he began to try to codify it, break it down as you would a color wheel or scales, notes, music, everything else. Not so that you could push the buttons, directors or teachers pushing buttons on actors to get them to, in the old, Del Sarti under the old-fashioned, this is, fear is on this side and horror is on this side, and that kind of systemized acting, but to build them into these archetypal exercises that the actor can work at day by day, so that he creates this continuous acting, this actor's system. People say, instrument, all kinds of names for it. Said actor's psychology, which meant the brain and the body, no more of one, no less than the other. We live our lives in such a peculiar way that we almost have no physical self. We sit in automobiles and drive on a freeway. We sit and our hands move a little bit, but the brain is rushing faster than the traffic. There was a philosopher whose name was either Darius or Marius. I can never really trail him down again, because he made only one contribution. He said that he thought that the human brain produced thought in very much the same way that the human liver produced bile. It's just what it does. It just goes on thinking and thinking, not necessarily to any effect. It just doesn't stop until it's over. And the intellectualizing and the worrying and the thinking, as opposed to the minimal use of our physical bodies, less and less as we're a non-agrarian, manual labor society, the more devices we have to go out and do aerobics, or we have to run, or we have to do some kind of a thing to keep this thing alive.
I'm laughing because not even Michael Chekhov wanted to do that. He didn't want to go for a walk with you.
No.
You didn't like to walk. But as far as being an actor was concerned, or doing any of the things where the physical impacted the psychology.
Yes, absolutely.
And then the psychology impacted. He could do that almost seemingly endlessly and with such marvelous effect.
Spectacular.
But ask him to just walk or just exercise him.
No. Would not. He couldn't even pronounce the word calisthenics. He never knew it when it ended. Tix, you'd have to almost nudge him to finish the word calisthenics. But yes, you're absolutely right, Mala. When he put a thought inside himself, when he took in an atmosphere, when he received something that had been radiated from outside, when he manifested an archetypal or psychological internal gesture, the whole physical man changed, I saw him become fat, heavy, tall, thin, and God knows, young, and then very old again.
I think you mentioned something one time that I'd love to hear you tell in more detail about an improvisation that was done one night in class. I'm not sure whether it was the Drama Society, but it was the poker game.
Yeah, well, I wasn't there. This was, again, before I was there. I mean, before you were there, too. I think this was with the group company or something that they had with Arthur Kennedy and Anthony Quinn.
That was before I was there, yes.
As Tony Quinn already told you about it, because I think I was in junior high school at the time, trying to find where this man was, and I kept hearing these rumors, and this became a legendary improvisation. I couldn't get there, I couldn't see him, but everybody talked about Chekhov had created this poker game improvisation that hand by hand finally got down to Akim Tamirov and Gary Cooper, which is said to have been one of the most brilliant pieces of a partnering in acting that's ever been done. Maybe the most famous, at least American, improvisation. And the word of it spread like a new hit show, but it was gone like that, like improvisation is.
So was it, do you know if it was an improvisation for ensemble? Was because Chekhov was always trying to get actors to really connect with each other, this intangible connection that then became visible. And I wonder if it was, from what you're describing, it seems like it might
I would imagine it was, because it started out as, a five-handed game or something, and came down to two. He talked once of, he would use games of playing billiards with Vakhtangov. And they decide, all right, this time you will win, this time I will win. And it never failed. But if they willed it that way, that's how it came out every time, the way they decided the game would go, like a play, like the last act of a drama. Somehow it worked out that way. And of course he used for the ensemble things like they'd throw medicine balls and tennis balls around kind of in silence, and then pretty soon you'd take the ball away, and they would do it with imagination, throwing
this
feelings.
Back and forth and back and forth, and the way the body gets it in actually the tossing of the ball, then the psychology takes it over, so you can do all kinds of rhythms and tempos, and he used to do a lot of that.
Oh yeah. And one of the first
tossing
things,
balls.
Yeah, one of the first things you did learn from him was that most of the time you really only give half of a performance, that the other half of your performance comes from your partner, and you are obliged to give them the other half of theirs. And you know, and I know, that if it's frustrating to be on stage or screen with somebody who won't give you anything, I think it's even more maddening to be working with somebody who won't take what you're trying to give them, And so there was always this 50% radiation receiving, game-like, two sides or more, if the ensemble increased, to every performance, and that we never really, except in monologue and soliloquy, and even there we work with imaginary partners. He taught me that you never talk to yourself. There's always somebody listening. We never even think to ourselves very much. We always have in our mind an imaginary judge or witness or listener of some kind. And he trained me to stop and say, who am I talking to now? Who is this directed? To whom is this directed? How am I getting this into my mind? Who am I using as my imaginary, invisible partner? And then what happens if I change it? It's very funny. Anybody can do it. If you have to, clean your room.
What a dreadful thought.
It's usually a dreadful thought, but if you say, all right, I'm going to clean my room now for my most critical relative, my mother, my sister, my competitive brother, whatever, and then halfway through or the next day you say, I'm going to clean it because I'm going to have a love affair in this room. And the next day you say, I'm going to clean it for my most casual friend who's as messy as I am. Your room will look different every day. The result, like the billiard game with Vakhtangov, you will make it come out a certain way.
Right.
And that's the imaginary partner.
So these are certainly some of the techniques that you still use, obviously, today when you're acting. And there must be many things that you still use consciously and other things that you use unconsciously. But consciously, can you name a few that you use a lot when you act today?
Well, first of all, again, there are the different places that we act. I do, as you said in your kind introduction. I do take off and do as many plays as I can do, not for much profit, but for for those parts, so that before we die we can play some of those parts while we go to television and movies. And I made a nice living saying nothing much more than throw out your gun or the girl dies in about 1,000 television shows. And
you were in the Hulk, of course.
I was in the Hulk, yeah. There I said, how green was he and which way did he go? And you more or less have a few lines that will carry you through the whole thing. They don't want a lot of characterization. They want something very, very close to one aspect of ourselves, as you know, in their situation. You go to the theater and you play, I just got through playing the devil in Shaw's Don Juan in Hell. And that's a different matter. Then you've got to think this and think that, and you sit still and you don't move. And then I played the ghost in Hamlet, and I was there able to use a lot of Mr. Chekhov's technique, because it works very well, particularly well, when you're playing a fantasy character.
Can you describe or tell me one or two things that you were conscious of using in the ghost?
Playing the ghost? Yeah. We did it about a year ago, and we did it in a rehearsal, modern dress technique. And Paul Scofield had just been on the screen playing it, the ghost, beautifully. He is a very real, very quiet, confidential friend to Hamlet. And I thought, well, I can't use that this year. I'd like to do it that way, but I can't. So you look through and you try to find your key line, and I came across it with, I am thy father's, spirit doomed for a certain term to walk the night. Now we see him doing that, so you don't have to worry about that. And for the day to fast in fires until the foul crimes done in my days of nature are burnt and purged away. So I decided to play this person right out of a crypt. And vocally I changed, in my speech I changed. I worked almost entirely from the joints of the body down to just the fingers, the skeletal kind of movement. And the walk had no muscle or ligament to it, only the joints. And yet I didn't want it to look like one of those mechanical mimes in front of a shop somewhere. And I simply used the idea of something that is being burned alive from within. And that, you sort of work with three parts of your body. You begin to think there's the muscular, then it's like those charts that open up in dictionary and medical books.
Yes.
And you go from the outer flesh into the nervous system, down to into the muscular, down to the skeletal. I don't know if that's the right order or not, but look it up, it's there. And I decided to play this really pretty much from just the skeletal and archetypal gestures and other things. So I think that would have been Mr. Chekhov's
right.
kind of
So that
approach.
it was working with both the physical and the imaginative then, because you had the skeletal idea, and then actually incorporating it, and then moving the body, which in turn influences the psychology again. And
yeah,
it's that wonderful.
even the voice, which I can't do because I had to warm up to it, but I listened to a lot of the recordings that they do now in horror films and such, where they distort the voice. And I thought, all right, they take down the treble this much and bring up the bass. Why can't I do that myself? And so I built this different voice, which is a little hard to stay in, but
Yes.
you have to learn to stay in. At one point, I determined that part of his tongue and jaw had been burnt away. And it was very creepy, everybody said, but then they couldn't understand what I was saying, so I threw that out.
That's the problem. We can over-characterize sometimes, and then nobody
anything,
understands
yes.
us. Yeah.
But Again, that was another of his points. You really have to overdo in order to find out where your cutoff
That's
point
right.
is, and then back up.
It's always easier to veil it, as he used to say, afterwards,
exactly.
than it is to not have it to begin with.
When you go to do film work, don't you find that the technique comes in, oh God, well, for one thing, there's that exhausting long day that is very hard on the actor. All the waiting and waiting and waiting, and the sort of the tail wagging the dog of movie making, that after the lights and everything are ready, then they're ready for the actor, who is this time pretty much asleep.
Yes, very
ready to
sleepy.
go.
You get very sleepy, especially after lunch, when
After
you wait
lunch.
and wait and wait.
And I find that's when I need to do expansion, or I need to do an inner exercise with lifting, or a variety of things. It's changed from a legato tempo to an inner staccato tempo, or things to bring you to life on the set. Also, I find it's very good in matching. You know, if you're hanging on the side of a cliff and you're really out on location and you're pretty much on the side of a cliff, it's wise to codify that in the terms of the technique and say, all right, I am contracted on this cliff, because perhaps a month or 6 weeks later we're back in a sound stage with a plaster side of a cliff 2 feet off the ground, and we have to try to match what it was. And if we can remember the kind of contraction that it took from this gesture of just the fingers contracting,
Right.
we can match, I think, very often better than people who don't have that technique.
Right.
And also the radiation and receiving, the partnership, which I think never leaves acting. I think it's always necessary, always has to be there. And
When you teach these things today, and you
Mm-hmm.
teach them to, let's say, young actors here in the 90s and so on, do you think that they respond to these things, that they get them faster than the people that we worked with?
don't you?
I do, yes, but I wanted to know what your experience is.
Again, it depends on the individual, of course, and some. But I think that period of the 60s and the 70s, the things that we just talked about, that we passed through, of accepting spiritual, mystical, at least relaxing and being a little less literal, has helped. I think the physicalization, the fact that people exercise more and do that, makes them at least more awake physically and responsive and willing to act with their bodies. And I also think an awful lot of some of the American misconceptions of use of memory have faded. Have you noticed that something very interesting is happening? There's a heading in one of Michael Chekhov's chapters, all acting is basically character acting. And as we grew up around this town, everybody found their type, and they were stars in pretty much one kind of a character until they got to be too old to be that, and maybe they did or did not make a transfer into playing mothers and nuns or sea captains or something older, and maybe they were simply finished. But if you look at actors and actresses now, such as Robert De Niro and Meryl Streep and Pacino, and of course the Irish and English actors and all, you see far more of Chekhov's kind of acting, I think. The kind of acting we were taught was, to be able to be a character, portray a character, create it. The difference is that in film it has to be more subtle.
Right.
And essentially the technique is always the same. Pavarotti and Peggy Lee do the same thing for a living. C sharp is C sharp, B flat is B flat. There's no two ways about it. He does it in La Scala. She does it with a microphone this close. But if they're off pitch, they're off pitch. If they don't sustain, they don't sustain. So essentially, the art, the craft is the same. It's like the scope on a rifle. It's the distance between you and the camera and you and a theater. And if you're in a small theater, it's still not the same as a long shot in a camera. And a big theater is different. Each one
has its own special
scope.
It isn't really a technique. The technique is to learn that they're different.
Yes.
That you're radiating a different distance. That
Yes.
you're making contact in a different space. It's learning how to work with space, both with your voice and with your body.
That's why I say like a rifle, like a scope, like, what is
So when you're directing, let's say you're directing a play,
Right.
how do you get that across to your actors, that spatial kind of...
One thing I have done, sometimes you just talk about it, and sometimes we just beg them, don't we, or threaten them or something. But I was working not too long ago. There was a young actress in a workshop, and for a year or so everyone had been telling her to talk louder, breathe from here and speak from there and everything else. And I decided to just work with radiation, receiving, partnering in a kind of a center. And I moved in very close, and I said, all right, now just start counting to me, but put it right here, put it right there. And I just backed up, and I backed up, and I backed up until I went off the stage, and I went out into the audience, and I backed up the aisle, and her voice came up and up and up, and as long as she stayed with the center and radiated at that, her voice grew and grew. When I got to the back of the room, she was speaking with quite a bit of projection. There was no flexibility in her voice. She now would have to learn to speak at that level with some range, but at least she had heard it. Mm-hmm. Once you hear it, you can't forget it. It's like grammatical errors, Once they're pointed out to you, you always, I've done it again.
It's good.
And so I find, don't you, when you direct and when you teach or coach with people, that by taking what is physiologically connecting with, we don't know is there such a thing as emotion. Emotion is a word that covers a great deal of territory of what we call responses, reflexes, reactions, impulses, etc., etc., etc. And people trying to court their memory, and memory is a liar, it's never...
We seldom seem to remember something that happened 10 years ago, and if we tell it and the person that was there too tells it, we find that it's often a very different story.
Yeah, the story, what is the blind man and the elephant, and what does it look like, or Rashomon, and those are stories about what happened and what we saw. It's not the same. It's going to be a little different now, I think. For a long time, we all were able to forge our own childhoods and pasts and talk about them as we remembered them. But now they're all on videotape, Our parents are photographing now, and children will grow up with evidence that they'll have to face. So that's how I sounded, so that's what I looked like.
If you had to pick one thing, I know this is an unfair question, but if you had to pick one or two things that you felt were the most important things you had gained through your association with Michael Chekhov, both humanly and as an actor, what comes into your mind right away?
I think the idea of continuous acting. Now this is meant to sound, he spoke of the universal man, or which would now be the universal person, I think. Person. Every person has a mind and a body. And the idea was that we are to try to experience all the arts and all of life, and to cultivate and develop that which is the most aesthetic in our nature, to permeate our entire minds and body with aesthetic qualities. Maybe that's where it began to sound spiritual, but it isn't. And I dabble with photography, with painting, with sculpture. with writing plays, with doing all these things, which is not really a boast, it's a confession. I do them all as an actor, whatever I do. If I paint a picture, I paint it like an actor. If I take a photograph, no matter what, I don't care if it's of a mountainside that Ansel Adams would have photographed it. When I photograph it, somehow it's like an actor has done it. It may be vaudevillian, it may be tragic, it may be something, but I somehow see always that I write a play, I write it for the actors and about actors, and as an actor would do it. Sometimes that's the way to go. Sometimes it produces good effects. Sometimes I think they're probably cheap and tawdry and not as good as somebody who paints as a painter and writes as a playwright. But I'm not sure I care. Essentially I am an actor. That is my religion. And that may be the one thing that Michael Chekhov was a little afraid of saying, I think, that the actor, who has always been considered really the tail end of the arts, the little one who mimics life, may in fact go back to the 60s to popular phrases of the day, celebrating life, which I got pretty tired of as an expression, but who more than actors and actresses celebrate life for us, show us life, in fact sometimes live much of the life we do not dare live. Actors probably have an obligation to the public and to the world not to debase life, not to debase ourselves and the acting, which is not to say we should always do uplifting and spiritually valid shows. You have to show what is right and wrong.
This constant trivializing of the human being, which we see.
Absolutely, and humiliating the human being, as we often see. And sometimes it's nice to see an audience, you see it on television sometimes, turn on the comedians and boo them. And it's usually over something like that they have gone just a little too far in making some kind of a joke about a physical thing or somebody's scandal that's really put them in a painful place. And every now and again, you can see that it's beginning to backfire a little, that kind of aggressive comedy. It's always there, a little cruelty in it. Certainly all the characters in drama can never be ideal people.
No, of course not.
There's no conflict.
I don't know anybody like that, do you?
I don't know anybody like that. But anyway, to go back, I think the idea of continual acting, which is not to be confused with being always on or affected, but simply looking at the world as a receptive person, creature who will one day radiate back what you have received and exchange it with a partner who does the same thing for a living or a profession or an art. I think that was it. I think that's the most important.
Is that basically what you say? Would you say to a young actor today about Michael Chekhov and his work and the reasons for learning about it?
Yeah, a lot of it depends, doesn't it, on how much passion they come at us with. A lot of prepositions here today in the wrong place. If they really want Michael Chekhov, you say, well, you really ought to be in this all Michael Chekhov group. If you want to learn how to act, maybe you should look at Michael Chekhov and read a few other people's books on acting, because some of them may be quicker, easier, less involving than Michael Chekhov. How much time do you have? I can't show you Michael Chekhov's whole technique in a couple of hours, a week for a month. The best ones are the ones who want Michael Chekhov and have already read all the books to the actor, the one that you recently brought
Michael
out.
Chekhov on the Technique of Acting.
Technique of Acting, and Deirdre Hurst Dupree's notes and books. And
Lessons to the Professional Actor.
And if they've dug through those and have questions, those are my favorite students, the ones who've maybe hit some snags, maybe don't quite realize why this one says this and that, because, you know, he was always changing, always refining, right to the end of his life. And toward the end was trying to modify everything to the film actor's approach and the American actor's approach. I found something in a letter that Michael Chekhov wrote to the Russian actor Nikolai Cherkasov about one of Eisenstein's films, and at the fact that it had a rather slow pace, and Chekhov was then in Hollywood and said, "Here they don't have pace, they have only haste." And it's accelerated even since then.
Oh, yes.
You know,
so much.
And it's true of me. I like a film with a faster pace than I think they did then and they did there.
Right. I think what happened to me was that the thing that saved me from entirely going in the haste direction, even though I understood what Chekhov was saying, was going to Japanese films years ago, where you might have the samurai, but you also had some of those wonderful films where they just stayed on the character's face, and you saw everything happening. And to the American taste, it was slow, but I developed a kind of love for that really going deeper and deeper, even though it was very slow and there was no action.
Right.
Yeah.
Michael Chekhov.
Right, and people who were doing his work and had been doing his work even before the fall of the communist government, long before that. Actually, even some of them had been doing it underground when it was like illegal to mention the name Michael Chekhov almost. So they had been, some of them, I mean the older ones had been involved with his work for a long time. The younger ones had come up. During the late 60s, Chekhov began to be a bit rehabilitated. You could talk about him now, at least, and they began to say what a great actor he was in Russia. But really, there was that period where you just couldn't mention his name at all. But it was a really wonderful time to be there and see the people that are exploring his techniques, and also a learning experience for me, because so many of the Russians, of course, had kept alive his very early techniques. Things that he had done in his workshops in Moscow when he was living there, that perhaps he had not given so much attention to in his later years when he began to develop his method in England and in America. So we have all these different periods of his life. It reminded me of Picasso in his blue period and this period. They're all very, very different, but still the genius always expresses itself. And there's not one of the exercises that I didn't find helpful. Although I remember Chekhov saying often to actors, if it doesn't work, don't do it.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. In
So there's so many exercises that one can do, and one kind works better for one person and another exercise for another. So there's no point in ever belaboring them and think that you have to learn them all, because it's not true.
When you were there and you were talking to the Russians, and they were, I'm sure, asking you as many questions as you were asking them, the ones who contacted me came here, and so I've met quite a few Russian actors and actresses and directors here, and they ask questions. Did they ask you, as they did me, how about his last years? Was he unhappy? Was he lost? Was he miserable in Hollywood, or was he happy? Did you get that as a question much?
I was kind of going to ask you about your feelings about that. As a matter of fact, I was just thinking that I would ask you about it. Yes, but I think that certainly this whole life of his, which was so fraught with political unrest, he was almost like forced from one place to another, a different language, a different country, a whole kind of thing where he had been such a huge star
Yes.
in his own, and not star in the way we mean it today, but he had been such a great actor and was so recognized, and people thronged to see
Almost
him.
like rock stars are today in
Yes.
a way when he performed these extraordinary performances, the characterization.
Yes. And then to find himself an exile, a man without a home, who was trying to work in theater, which was not his language, all over Europe. And of course he did some magnificent performances in his work with Reinhardt and everything, but he never again had that kind of success. And then to come to the United States. But what happened, of course, was that he then began to really refine his method of acting, and that became his joy. And he was still doing that, as you mentioned earlier, here in Hollywood, where this time span, as he said to you, it's not tempo wasn't the word used, but haste.
Yes, we have no pace. They have only haste.
Yes, no pace, just haste. But he still did everything he could to help the actor accommodate
Yes.
that haste, because he knew that that's where his livelihood was there. So he was always refining his method. So I think he found a certain joy in that, in being able to help. And then, of course, in his own personal life, his whole philosophic structure deepened and changed so in the last few years that I think that what he found as a human being during those years was very fulfilling to him. But as far as of course acting or theater, there was so little of it that he could do, especially because he was quite ill. He couldn't even work to the capacity that he would like to have been able to. So from an acting or theater standpoint, I think they were very frustrating years for him. But what he was, what he felt he was gaining through his own meditative work, through his own study and learning, as he always kept doing, and working on himself, I think he found that rather fulfilling.
I don't think he ever went a day without it, did he? Without
No.
the idea of continuously thinking it, exercising it, making notes on it, writing about it, coaching somebody, teaching a class at night, going somewhere to give a lecture. He was not terribly social, and yet people came to him.
Right.
Now, in the Tamirov class, for example, some of the people that were there were...
Oh, well, I'm sure that Anthony Quinn was there, and I hear that Marlon Brando was there, though not when I was there.
Yeah.
And Burt Lancaster, I remember, came one evening, and Tracy Roberts, and there were a great many people, many of whom I don't even know about. You know?
When I would go for my private class on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, it fluctuated a little bit. Marilyn Monroe was the class before me, although she was already a star. She was frequently not there.
And of course, she worked with Chekhov privately too.
Yes,
she
that's
worked
what
a
I'm
lot
saying,
with
at
Chekhov
the house.
privately.
And
right.
the truth was that when I've talked to these people, I said, you have to realize that when he arrived in late 42, early 43, I think it was, Hollywood was loaded with everybody you would normally have met in Paris or Berlin years before. Stravinsky was here, and Savoyarok was here, and Schoenberg was here. Garbo was in and out and still back and forth. Bertolt Brecht was here. Thomas Mann, Friedrich Mann. There was a sort of a salon at the home of Alma Mahler, and another one at the home of Salka Viertel, and Hurok had his own groups. And the British actors who seemed to really admire him, John Abbott, for example, and Charles Laughton and Iris Tree, the daughter of Sir Herbert Beerbohm Tree, and Michael Chekhov tried a little experiment up in Ojai, and all these great people, Ingrid Bergman, who had, I think, studied with him a little in Europe or gone to classes, really adored him, and Patricia Neal and Gregory Peck and Quinn and people like that. Tamirov, who did everything to try to introduce him to people.
Yes,
so
he did, yes.
He didn't go out to them a lot, but whenever he spoke or something, they came to him.
Exactly.
And they were a pretty appreciative audience for him. I know his book was not successful during his lifetime to the actor.
And yet, of course, it went on and on and on afterwards,
yeah.
right?
Senya, I spoke to, she said, you know, it's 15 years now. I did not think to live so long without him. And I tried to cheer her up, saying, you know, his book is still, after all these years, in hardback. It's still on the shelves at Samuel French. And she said, yes, but in his life, it was his last sorrow. You know. But was anybody happy the year they died? I think probably a little yes, a little no. I think he had some awfully productive days and nights and meetings with people here. And he did have that wonderful, silly sense of humor.
Right.
With the umbrella, and you're going to look up, you're going to look down. And
in a way, that reminded me of continuous acting.
yeah.
You know, because he took his umbrella, there was still something of that in him, which he also was critical of himself about many times,
Yes.
because he felt that he was on too much. You know?
Yes, yes.
And hardly recognized the fact that that's what people were waiting for with bated breath, was to see him demonstrate
we
something.
all have to be very suspicious of ourselves.
Yes.
With continuous acting. Yeah. And we must know when we're playing vaudeville. Vaudeville, I think, is all right. To play silly and entertain people and be on that way is good. To dramatize your serious feelings is a little difficult to allow. You have to really be suspicious of yourself there. The Russians have made certainly an art form of being unhappy. And he was a sort of an atypical Russian in many ways. He had possibly overcome that Russianness, mixed it with an international or a spiritual something that allowed him to, he was the Hamlet who wanted to be a clown, you know.
And he had a certain sense of humor about himself.
Oh yes,
yes.
Oh yes, yes. And about, he would say, and you know, mimic everything. We were talking about feeling old, you know. He would lecture me and say, and of course, you're a young man, you know, and young people must have sex in order to be healthy. Not to me anymore, thank God I am an old man now, you know. He was out of those things, and he would mimic himself or ridicule himself as he said once, he said, everybody thinks I'm such a saint, you know, and he said, the truth is, it's easy because I go home and I take everything out on my big wife. And Senya let him, you know, he would snap at her and she was, oh, he cares for me, you know.
That was true. I think I remember he used to call her his lower self.
Yes, here comes my lower self. She was more practical and rational and said, go take walks.
Yes, but she also was just one huge heart walking around. So, I mean, he didn't hurt her.
No, no.
She understood that and took that all very well.
And after his death, she lived actually not very far from here. And I think she was pretty much absorbed by the Russian community here.
Yes.
Of which there's quite a large community around this area, and down in Santa Monica and places, quite a few Russians. Mm-hmm. They were then, of course, that was in the red hunting days, they were usually called Ukrainians, and they let it go at that. It's like the Germans in World War II were all Bavarians, you know. Mm-hmm. But,
do you remember the last time you saw Michael Chekhov?
The last time I saw Michael Chekhov was, I was about to go to New York to do my first play in New York. And it, I think, must have been a little more than 2 weeks before he died. Mm. And it was at the Drama Society in that building on Harper, mm-hmm. Which is now a parking lot for the restaurant upstairs. And it was in September, and he died the last day of September.
Yes.
And so it must have been about the first week of, and we had a little drizzle. It was a chilly night, and he had on an overcoat and was carrying an umbrella. And when I brought this down, When he came into the room, he was standing and talking to somebody, and on the inside flap of my notebook, where I would doodle things, I doodled this little sketch of him, pretty bent, and I didn't realize that close to death. I thought I would see him again in the spring somehow, because he had been old and young so many times. But I did this, which may well be the last living portrait of Michael Chekhov, and forgot about it, and only found it years later in one of the notebooks on the fly leaf.
That's amazing that you did draw that.
A curious thing happened. I don't know if you noticed. I mean, the memory school, the American school, the New York School of method, to which he was somewhat opposed. Stella Adler, George Stanoff, and others have become more adamant than Chekhov bothered to be, I think, during his lifetime. He dismissed it, the school of the memory, the affective memory of going into the pain of your own life and digging things out. And it was curious because Michael Chekhov died quietly in his sleep the last night of September of '55. And at dawn on the highway the next morning, James Dean was killed in that wreckage, and they were both on the front page of the New York Times, and I was there, and oh my God, and it was quite a shock. And from James Dean's death onward, the great promotion, although Brando and Clift had preceded him, the great promotion of the New York internalized, overly psychological memory school became more and more popular, which drove Stella Adler and George Stanoff crazy. Chekhov, luckily, had been more or less spared a lot of that, I think. There was a kind of a transition at about that time that moved on. And some young people behaved pretty absurdly during that period until around the 60s and 70s. All the young men decided they wanted to be rock stars instead, and we found out who really wanted to be an actor or not. But I think he'd had his quarrel with Stanislavski on the subject. They were not that polar, and if you remember, we always began our studies with Stanislavski's system of breaking down objectives.
Objectives, absolutely.
Units of objectives, authors' objectives, characters' objectives.
Right. Chekhov always said that there's not much that can be improved upon this.
No.
He offered one or two suggestions over and above it that he had found useful, but basically it was entirely Stanislavski's
Yeah, I remember
system.
him once talking about Stanislavski and Topolovsky and all those other Slavskis that are there. He never really, I don't remember, attacked or went into his own personal quarrel with
Oh no, I never
Stanislavski
heard
in
that
our
from him
teaching.
either.
No.
No.
He simply moved on.
But he
and-
loved Stanislavski. I mean,
Yes.
humanly,
Yes,
he
yes.
loved Stanislavski. And Chekhov didn't believe in letting your critic get out there very much. In other words, if there was something that was wrong, I think he taught all of us in class, ask what can be done to make it better.
Yes.
It doesn't have
Yes.
any value to say what's wrong with it unless you make that link to what can be done to make it a little bit better,
Yes.
or what should have been done at this moment to have taken it in a different direction. That's what his focus was.
Exactly. In the book, he talks of Stanislavski saying, take the technique and make it your own, go further, and he told us the same thing. You know, I find I can't make it get much better than it is, except to possibly find paraphrases, synonyms, possibly more American words for things, or comparisons to more contemporary
Right.
Discoveries, technology, one thing and another. But in essence, I'm sure you've heard people talk about the split between Stanislavski and Michael Chekhov and compare it to the Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung split, if only because that word archetype, went away with Chekhov and Jung. And while I would not agree on all points of that, I do think there are certain justifiable similarities there, that what in archetypal human behavior happens is the area of artistic creation, and that behavior in this time or next year or 10 years ago or Shakespeare's time or Ibsen's is a variation, an adaptation, a modification, and taking into consideration certain things, and then back to the discussion of whether the camera is here or the camera's back there, or the stage is around you or the stage is out. These are judgments you make finally, but the central acting idea, what we call, I guess, talent, technique, the continual acting, aside from everything else, makes life more interesting.
Absolutely. And it's certainly been interesting talking with you, Jack. And
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
very
Maria.
much for talking with us today.
My
And I
pleasure.
have a feeling that that now that we're just about concluding this particular episode of Jack Colvin's Life and Encounters with Michael Chekhov, that you and I will end up going over and talking for another hour or so, because our favorite subject is Michael Chekhov. Thank you for being with us. I'm Mala Powers.
Thank you.